Tonight, dear listeners, we have a tale of a phantom of sorts, the variety composed of steel and salt. A story of secrets and death, oh so gruesome, written in a scene of carnage pulled straight from a nightmare. Evidence that upon first glance screams paranormal, though under closer inspection may reveal something much darker and much more, unfortunately, human. This is the Ill Tidings podcast, and I'm your host. So let's find ourselves adrift in the South Pacific in the late 1940s, a very tumultuous set of years fresh off the heels of a war of mass destruction and death, and stepping into a new, burgeoning war of paranoia and proxies. In this time of reconstruction, of new beginnings, unfortunately, the dirty little secrets of yesterday tend to get hushed away, at least until they refuse to stay beneath the surface. The vast open ocean has always held a majesty, one that lies somewhere between magical, mysterious, and quite deadly. Alien, desolate stretches of the earth that connect and also separate us, composed of the basest element of our existence, the very water that sustains not only our short, mortal lives, but also the catalyst, the womb of all life on Earth. The sea is a foreboding, hostile place, a place not meant for man, despite our very dependence on it. And maybe that's where the allure lies, the endless possibilities of what's just over the horizon. Ever since as a species we've learned to build, we've set out to overcome the sea, forging collections of timber, cloth, and rope, arranged so precisely conditioned to fight against the rapid atrophy of sun above and brine below. Some of our greatest collective accomplishments have been forged in this pursuit. Grand Leviathan structures launched atop the waves, displacing thousands of tons of water in their wake, serving as home and sustenance for hundreds, if not thousands, of our species for months on end. And as is our nature, becoming the flagships of our destruction, the largest weapons ever made. Just as all that is built will eventually crumble, all that is made to float will eventually sink. The sea reclaims all, sometimes in a form much quicker, much more chaotic, tragic than we've expected, and sometimes without a trace at all. Who's to say what becomes of these specters of these vessels? Maybe you've heard this saying, as above, so below. There's different interpretations of these words. To me, it's speaking of reflections, of inverses. As our maritime vessels, our behemoths and ocean liners represent man's arrogance, his attempts to reign over the powers of nature, then, consequently, these phantom vessels must be the symbol of our flimsy mortality in the face of something so vast and oh so unconquerable as the sea. And that's where our story begins tonight. As long as we've set our eyes on the sea, paranormal fascination has followed. Conveyed first through oral legend, hushed stories told fireside to the background of waves lapping in the distant night, tales of curses, of monsters in the depths, of figures appearing on misty shorelines. Stories brought to life, evidenced by detritus washed occasionally to shore, the last whispers of some tragedy occurring beyond the horizon. We're going to focus on one particular type of these legends: ghost ships. While in deep antiquity there have been many types of ghost lights, many allegorical and mythological ships traversing either the skies or the lands of the dead, the type of ghost ship we're looking at exists somewhere between a derelict and a phantasm. First appearing in our writings from the Age of Sail, the period between the late 15th to 19th centuries, where the demands of global trade, slavery, and warfare fed an interwoven membrane of supply lines that crisscrossed the world's oceans. From this time, we've been given stories such as the ethereal Flying Dutchman, a ship carrying a crew of specters damned never to make port, or the Lady Lovabond, an actual vessel which sank during a bridal party after a hijacking by a jilted lover, now doomed to repeat the act every 50-year anniversary. And of course, the infamous Mary Celeste, a brigantine which in 1872 was found adrift in the Atlantic by a fellow merchant ship, the Negrata. Upon boarding and inspection, the Mary Celeste revealed a desolate scene, left abandoned suddenly and with no sign of trouble, only some missing navigational equipment and a final entry in the ship's log, recorded 9 days earlier and 400 nautical miles from where she was found. For tonight, we're going to travel a distant 75 years from the fateful finding of the Negrata, to a time when sailing had changed in ways that would seem so unfathomable to the crew who found the abandoned Celeste. When the aforementioned wood and timber were replaced with metal and oil, sails gone, traded for propulsion that cares nothing for wind or wave, to ships that bore massive destruction with their guns and planes and carried innumerable men to their deaths on distant beaches. It's June 27th, 1947. The Silver Star, an American steamship, is sailing through the Strait of Malacca, the narrow stretch of ocean between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra in Southeast Asia. The war has settled down, and the region has found a level of stability in its aftermath of reconstruction through a shifted global balance of power. The waves are calm in the midday sun when a sudden burst of Morse code alerts the Silver Star's radio man. It's a frantic, erratic stream of dots and dashes. He starts translating the message.
SOS. Ship Ourang Medan. All ships with shortwave radio, please relay urgent requests for medical aid.
The message abruptly ceases as the radio operator calls an alert. Another ship, the city of Baltimore, relatively nearby, picks up the distress call as well. The radio operator of the Silver Star fires a quick message back to the Ourang Medan requesting her position. It's strange. That information should have been included in her first message. Time is of the essence after all. After a brief, tense pause, a message taps back.
179 degrees west, 20 degrees south.
The message then dies for a moment before sparking back to life in an erratic burst.
We drift. All officers, including the captain, are dead. Lying in chart room and bridge. Possibly whole crew dead.
Ominously, the message fades into an incoherent scrawl. Only 2 last words are decipherable.
I die.
Immediately changing her bearing, the Silver Star sets full steam toward the Medan's position, tearing as quickly as she can through the water. The city of Baltimore, I guess just Baltimore was taken, radios her. She's much further away at 800 nautical miles compared to the Silver Star's 210. So she continues on course, but promises to maintain contact. She's the only of the 3 ships with a doctor on board. In her rush toward the Medan, the Silver Star attempts to raise her as night settles. Only silence and the dark, empty ocean lay ahead. After an all too long and too short night, first light starts to crest the horizon. Nearing the position of the distress call, the Silver Star sights a vessel drifting in the distance, the sun rising pink and red behind her. It's an old steamship, something of a pre-war relic. She's in the water with a slight list, no smoke from her stack, and no flag raised. Several more attempts to raise her are met with no response. Drawing closer, there is an eerie vacancy on her deck, no sign of life coming from the vessel. There is no sign of damage either. Drawing metaphorical straws, the Silver Star's first mate is chosen to take a small party aboard. The men gather in the rowboat and start the traversal between ships. Reaching the flank of the Medan, a particular smell seems to emanate from her. Something chemical underlying the breeze. Ascending to her deck, a grisly sight meets them. The crew is still there, a series of corpses sprawled in various states of panic. Some on their backs, faces toward the sky, mouths gaping, like they died gasping or screaming, with dried lips pulled back over bared teeth and blank eyes staring into the sun. The passageways below deck aren't any better, strewn with the rest of the crew, all in similar distress. Arms outstretched and contorted like grasping at some invisible, horrid attacker. Yet not a single drop of blood mars the steel passageways. Everything seems to appear in order as it should be. Only the corpses belie any sign of struggle. Despite their horrid expressions, contortions, and rigor mortis, no injuries can be found on any of the bodies. Even the ship's dog is found in a petrified snarl. In the radio room, the operator is found slumped over his desk, still wearing his headphones. The last known survivor, his hand is cold on the telegraph key. The captain and engineer are found as well, in the bridge and chart room respectively, and just as promised. Strangely, the ship's papers seem to have gone missing, and the lower holds are knee-deep with water. A count of all dead officers and crew tallies at 22, a skeleton crew, as the ship was large enough 40 would have been needed to operate her sufficiently. The first officer makes another note. Most of the crew members they find are Asian, most likely recruited nearby, though the ship herself is revealed to be a Dutch vessel. Back above deck, her lifeboat is found to be missing as well. The ropes that secured it left dangling, tapping against her stern. As the boarding party starts preparations to tow her, shouting rings out from the Silver Star. There's smoke coming from the Medan, billowing out of the number 4 hold. The boarding party quickly scrambles off the ship, hurrying back to the Silver Star as more flames erupt. The Silver Star backs away a safe distance, her crew watching from the deck as flames engulf the other ship entirely, pouring a massive black cloud into the late afternoon sky. She burns, until another hold violently explodes, sending the Medan into a deep list, capsizing her, dragging her down into the murky water, taking her crew and her mystery forever into the cold, dark depths below. A vessel appears with a cry for help, and she is found, though in a strange state, with a mystery seemingly tucked away in her hulls and holds, spilled out over her decks, written in the disfigured, ghastly crew, and cried out in her albeit brief distress call. One would first ask just who was this mystery vessel? Where did she come from? While we've heard her origins were Dutch, one might not have gleaned that by her name, Ourang Medan. That'd be because those words aren't actually Dutch, they're Malay, her name most likely given to match her theater of operation. Man of Medan is the translation, the word Ourang being Malay meaning man, Medan being the largest city on the island of Sumatra, which, if you remember, is not too distant from where she was found. And from Medan being another way of phrasing it. Always with names on this show. As for what type of vessel she was, well, that'd be one with an already inherent amount of danger. She was a steamship, a floating hunk of metal propelled by a huge scalding boiler, an iron-hulled beast of early 1900s design who'd churn a pillar of black smoke in her wake. Something of a decrepit old man by the time of her sinking, old enough she'd most likely still only be in service due to budgetary decisions rather than practical, with a max speed far likely under 20 miles an hour, not exactly cutting through the water. Being a steamship, she was a severely outdated model even at that time, as diesel combustion engines had replaced even the most powerful steam propulsion. Still, it wouldn't be entirely uncommon to find one on the seas, even as they were being phased out. The danger they posed being a major reason, not to other vessels particularly, but from what was within. While much more able to weather the harsh conditions of the ocean compared to sail ships, there was a heavy price paid in exchange. That source of their power is also their greatest risk. Huge boilers of water are superheated, evaporated into steam, whose pressure is used to move equally huge pistons, which in turn power the driving mechanism. Either a large circular paddle, or most likely in the Medan's case, a large screw-type propeller. What's important to know from this is that steam has many, many times more pressure than water, and all of that is stored in an iron cylinder. See where we're going? A steamship is the kind of ship where when something goes wrong, there's usually not too many injuries, because they're mostly fatalities. It's the type of ship which portentously killed Mark Twain's brother back in our Precognitive Dreams episode. For example, in the late 1800s, an American steamship, the SS, which just by the way means steamship, something apparently obvious that I never knew until now, but I digress. The SS Sultana, carrying 2,300 repatriated Union prisoners of war just weeks after the American Civil War, exploded when her boiler ruptured, sending at least 1,800 people to their graves. It'd be like having a bomb for a heart, essentially, and a rather fickle one at that. Though, ironically, arguably the most famous steamer of her time, and one of our greatest known maritime disasters, the Titanic, was destined to meet her fate in a much more spectacular manner. Ourang Medan just as well. The story of her sinking, of the Silver Star's boarding party, and the dramatic climax of her explosion first gained notoriety, appearing rather hidden and nonchalantly in the middle of an article titled, "We Sail Together," published on May 9, 1952 by the U.S. Coast Guard in their magazine Proceedings of the Merchant Marine Council. And yes, this was officially released by the government. though the lines of distinction between military and civilian would take some time to settle in the post-war years. The story of the Medan herself, only taking up a third of a page in a rather long article, reads essentially as our retelling does. Quote, "Perhaps one of the most perturbing sea dramas occurred in February 1948. Radio silence was broken with an urgent SOS from the SS Ourang Medan, a Dutch vessel then proceeding through the Straits of Malacca. Later, the Ourang Medan was found adrift approximately 50 miles from her indicated position. When the vessel which had stumbled across her sent a boat over to investigate, the sailors swarming aboard found a sight seldom seen. There wasn't a living person or creature on board. There were dead men everywhere. Bodies were strewn about the decks. Sprawled on their backs, the frozen faces upturned to the sun with mouths gaping open and eyes staring. The dead bodies resembled horrible caricatures. Yet the bodies seemed to bear no sign of injury or wounds. Then, when a fire was discovered in the number 4 hold, she had to be abandoned. A few minutes later, an explosion followed and the Ourang Medan sank. To this day, no explanation has been offered as to what might have happened to the unfortunate ship's company." Told pretty dryly and with little fanfare, the article then moves on to the subject of the Titanic, leaving the entire chilling tale of the Medan as little more than a blip in a long line of shipwreck stories, all to support the actual point of the article being cooperation in maritime safety. Despite the brevity of the Coast Guard's mention of the event, the article lit a firestorm of curiosity around the mystery, gaining traction in the paranormal and weird news world, with retellings in magazines such as Fate, True Reports of the Strange and Unknown, magazines of which gave us such incredible headlines as "Sinister Dirigibles Over Russia" and "Are the Saucers Space Animals?", which is something I'd definitely like to know. This was the start of America's fascination with flying saucers, after all. In 1955, the author Morris K. Jessup published an article, "The Case for the UFO," citing the Ourang Medan. Remember how the bodies were said to have been pointing, staring at the sky? Well, maybe it was a UFO which attacked them, causing the bizarre states of death with some unknown form of weaponry, the article speculated. The backbone of the argument being that all non-paranormal explanations had been ruled out, leaving only room for the fantastic. He also drew, once again, speculative connections to the fabled Philadelphia experiment. Outside the types of magazines Fox Mulder's B-team of weirdos would read, the story made its way even into the government, to the secretive halls of the CIA, which, honestly, I'll take the group of weirdos over any day. In December 1959, the assistant to the director of the CIA, name redacted in the document, received a letter written by one C.H. Mark of Arizona. The letter supposedly was classified as top secret, only being released to the public in 2003, and you can still find a PDF of it on the CIA.gov website. In the letter, Mark types this message: "I feel sure that the SS Ourang Medan tragedy holds an answer to many of these airplane accidents and unsolved mysteries of the sea. Also, I have often thought about the many sightings of huge fiery spheres rising from the sea or disappearing into the sea by ships' captains and crews in the 18th and 19th centuries." He then recounts further sightings of these fiery spheres, not all nautical, dating back to Dark Age England. While this document is fun and it's tempting to point toward as an example of some cover-up, some wider conspiracy, or just CIA shenanigans. It's important to note that Mark was not actually a member of the CIA. While the letter was archived, the redacted named assistant's response elucidated the CIA's concern in the case.
Dear Mr. Mark, on behalf of Mr. Doles, may I acknowledge and thank you for your letter of 29 May. Although we are unable to answer your questions, your letter is very interesting and we appreciate your concern in these matters.
Definitely a cold shoulder if I've ever had one. While Mark most probably just had too much time on his hands and a lot of ideas in his head, it is important to note that this is also late 1950s CIA, the one currently knee-deep in the incredibly insane, stupid, and destructive MK Ultra program. So I'll give a bit of a pass to anyone who's not exactly confident with what they've chosen to release from this era, or what other silly, life-destroying shenanigans they could have been up to. While the Coast Guard's article gave the story its first big surge in popularity, interest in the mystery also led sleuths to unearth a spat of articles, published and forgotten years before the Merchant Marine Council. Ranging from August to October 1948, papers such as the San Francisco Examiner and the Atlanta Constitution published the same two-page spread, titled Secrets of the Sea. More or less the same retelling of both events. Both articles, while not making as much of a splash as the Coast Guard's, were found to have come from the same source, a series of articles in a Dutch-Indonesian newspaper, De Locomotief, the locomotive. Interesting, the ship was of Dutch origin after all. It's in these locomotive articles that another wrinkle appears, something that might have been lost in translation, disappearing before the story found its way to the Coast Guard's printing room. An eyewitness. Trails of smoke dispersed into the wind, and the waves settled. The Silver Star changed her bearings, resuming her original course through the Solomon Islands. A story the only passenger they'd picked up from the distress call, any trace of the Medan lost to 5,000 meters of crushing depth. 3 weeks later, on July 12, 1949, the wooden bow of a lifeboat washed ashore in the Marshall Islands. Inside the boat, 7 passengers were found, 6 of whom had already given up the ghost, the last surviving member barely clinging to life. A missionary took him under his care, and as the man recovered, he revealed his story. His name was Jerry Rabbit. Rabbit was in Shanghai in early June when a ship came into port, an old Chinese steamer retrofitted from a wartime troop or cargo transport. The mystery ship began recruiting locals, and to his surprise, Jerry was chosen for second officer, no papers necessary, something not really heard of in legitimate business. But work was work, and Jerry could keep his mouth shut. That night, 7,000 boxes of cargo were whisked into the ship's hold, and she set sail as the morning rose. Her course was rather meandering, avoiding common shipping routes and picking up more secretive cargo. Jerry Rabbit, despite his second officer status, did not know her final destination, given only the vague Costa Rican shoreline. That distance of a journey was unsettling to the ship's crew, as her seaworthiness and condition were questionable at best, though the promise of a large bonus kept them focused eastward. Until several more days into the journey when a sailor collapsed while unscrewing a windscoop. Thought unconscious at first, he was dead by the time they'd reached him. Dismissed as a heart attack, the captain had him tossed overboard. Several more of the crew started falling ill. Water had started leaking into the holds, spilling onto the cargo as well. Something dreadful, ominous seemed to seep from those holds. One of these stokers collapsed soon after, dead as he hit the ground, the first of several. The unsettled crew now begged the captain to turn around to send a distress call. The death was declared heat stroke and the ship was ordered to maintain course. The writing was on the wall for Rabbit and crew. In the night, he, along with 6 others, boarded the life raft, leaving the ship to its fate. Jerry recalled the holds to the missionary, the cargo which was so carefully hidden away in the ship's belly. He remembered looking at some papers, not quite a manifest, but he did see some chemical compounds, sulfuric acid, cyanide, and nitroglycerin. So the story goes, there is much speculation about what the cargo could possibly have been. The big question is, why would the Medan be carrying this cargo in the first place? Was she just a smuggler? Or something more insidious tied to her roots as a military vessel? Theories are that she was indeed a smuggler, a converted wartime ship carrying military loot, hiring crew, and, well, just got in above her head. The chemicals listed by Jerry in the hold do not play nicely with salt water. Cyanide can release toxic fumes. Sulfuric acid, for example, grows in heat, boils, and releases very flammable hydrogen gas. You can picture the rest. That's the smuggling theory, at least. What if the truth were much larger, much more important than a few illicit goods? Have you heard of the USS Indianapolis, the ship that during the war took the secret mission of delivering the components of the nuclear bombs that would be used on Japan? Only after delivering her cargo was sunk by a submarine, 800 of her crew left to perish in shark-infested waters. Good day to be a shark, at least. What if the Medan was and wasn't in Shanghai in an official capacity? Only 2 nations used nerve agents in World War II, Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. During the Japanese occupation of China, a specialized research unit was formed, Unit 731. A covert biological and chemical warfare research unit, Manchu Detachment 731 was stationed mostly in Manchuria, a unit of genocide which carried out Holocaust-level human experimentation on the occupied civilians in pursuit of a chemical or biological weapon that'd win the war. What actual useful knowledge was gathered from these completely horrid, inhumane experiments will never fully be known. In honesty, probably very little, as is usually the case. Just a lot of pointless human suffering. In the post-war vacuum left from the fall of the Japanese Empire, this potential knowledge, and more usefully, potential weapons found themselves in the crosshairs of the now burgeoning Cold War between the East and West. Researchers were the largest commodity. Their knowledge and any possible advancements in bio and chemical weaponry would be swept up with them as well. Of course, these war criminals were, on the surface, very frowned upon, at least on paper. The use of chemical weapons has been banned since the Geneva Protocol, signed in 1925. Though, why let potentially valuable knowledge go to waste in prison or find the end of a rope at a trial? Or, even worse, fall into the hands of your enemies? On the other side of the Atlantic, Operation Paperclip was in full swing, transferring roughly 1,600 Nazis away from the justice of the Nuremberg and following war crime trials. So, General Douglas MacArthur, on behalf of the United States, worked to actively cover up much of Unit 731's crimes, offering pardons and even payment to the unit's commanders and biochemists for the results of their experiments. This was in addition to keeping them sheltered from the Tokyo tribunals. The vestiges of this unit were left not only in the mass graves now being secreted away, but were littering warehouses and bunkers. The physical, tangible effects of this experiment in human slaughter. The weapons. This would prove to be some truly volatile cargo, much too risky to move via plane overhead. Would cause too many questions if brought by train and loaded onto military ships, not to mention the risk. A ship such as an unassuming old cargo steamer could feasibly be overlooked. A few details such as the name fabricated and a secret mission tasked to her, crewed with expendable locals in the unfortunate case anything were to go wrong. And in that definitely unfortunate case, the crew would be the last subjects to experience these weapons. Though who's to say there was only one ship? While the theories behind the Medan's voyage are quite sensational, a convergence of a very fascinating time with a fascinating lack of human morals, we still need to look at this story with a bit of a skeptical eye. For that, we're going to go back to the locomotive, that Dutch newspaper, and the 3 articles that seem to be the genesis of all this. Said articles were attributed to one man, a Silvio Schlerie, a figure only really existing as a name. The author, Silvio Schlerie, is in Trieste. He vouches for the authenticity of this story. Is how the locomotive ends the first article of the run. Silvio would reveal in the second article of supposedly learning this story from that unnamed missionary, the one who would return to Trieste after nursing Jerry Rabbit back to health. Well, believe it or not, if you've been paying attention so far, there's been a few discrepancies in the story. Shocking, right? Well, to start, let's look at a little matter, the actual date of the event. Remember when I said the Medan sank in February of 1948? Or how about when I said July 1949? It was 1947 at the beginning, wasn't it? Small details, easy to mistake. Well, we'll just fall back on the location then. I did say the Strait of Malacca. Well, until it was the Solomon Islands. Then the lifeboat did wash ashore somewhere in the Marshall Islands. She probably could have drifted quite a ways, right? I mean, just how big can the Pacific Ocean be? Well, over 4,000 miles at least. That's just the distance between the first 2 locations. Remember, she probably couldn't even hit 20 miles an hour on a good day, running at full steam. And I'm sure if you know more about sailing and ships than I do, you've probably been yelling at your screen for a while now. Sorry about that. These discrepancies exist here for a reason outside of my usual laziness. Let me explain. You see, all of our information today has been pulled together, constructed from many little pieces. All those articles, different books, each with their own twists, their own takes on the story. I've just assembled them into the best arrangement for my telling of the tale. Without necessarily making anything up, mind you, all I've said has been pulled from these sources. It's just that everyone seems to have a slightly different telling of the Medan. The original author, Silvio Schlary, whose name I'm probably mispronouncing, seemed to have a few retellings of his own. So, with that swelling of interest that followed the Coast Guard's article came a great deal of skeptical observation that there are no records of any ship actually registered as the Ourang Medan. As we've discussed, that name might have been a smuggler pseudonym anyways. What about the Silver Star? That was a real ship, right? Ends up, she was. Built in 1942 as the Santa Cecilia, then renamed to the Silver Star in 1946, only to be bought and renamed a third time, now in 1947 to the Santa Juana. Still arguably plausible that she may have responded to a distress call as the Silver Star sometime in 1947. You know, one of the years it could have happened in. Let's be fair, in tellings and retellings, dates can happen to change. Locations can be misremembered or mistold, especially secondhand. While suspicious, all the elements are still quite plausible. Really, there'd only be a smoking gun pointing toward fake if, say, the story were already printed before, from the same author but with rather different details. Unfortunately for Silvio, he'd already sent the story to a British newspaper, the Daily Mirror, back in 1940, nearly an entire decade before the event was to take place. The article headlined, "Crew Dies in SOS Mystery." Oops. That article, once again the fantastic tale of the sinking of the Ourang Medan, does introduce a few wrinkles into the later retelling. And by a few, I mean a veritable Gordian knot of wrinkles. First, the SOS reads rather differently this time, requesting a warship in the area, understandably left out of the post-war message, as well as excluding the very dramatic monologue with the infamous "I die." As for the very plausible Silver Star, as we've seen, she hadn't actually been built yet. In fact, the rescue ship in the 1940 telling isn't named, just simply called a ship from the British Merchant Marine. The sole survivor is a German now, excluding the fabulously named Cherry Rabbit and the unknown missionary. This German ultimately ends up in Trieste, Italy, and that's where the link is. It's there he supposedly relays the story to the author of the articles. What's interesting is that in both tellings, the story ultimately ends on the shores of Trieste, a city clear on the other side of the world. It's just so far removed from the action, so specific a place to show up in two tellings a decade apart, which is the tie to Silvio, which may or may not be the author's actual name. The author might have been a sailor or had some experience on the sea. Maybe they wanted to capture a bit of that mystery, the sense of allure the unknown brings when the sight of land disappears somewhere over the curvature of the earth. Probably the story just didn't quite gain the notoriety he'd wanted the first time, so he never really stopped telling it, sending the fate of the Ourang Medan to several other publications, each time the details growing more lurid, more grisly. Then, finally, it just seemed to resonate in the 1950s, to take on that life of its own. Does this mean we should discount the story? Why waste time telling it when the facts have been proven rather demonstrably false? I mean, the story is pretty obviously fabricated, dramatized from the start. And yet, as I've said, it's found resonance. Still, to this day, it is told, hiding in the midst of plausibility at a glance, teeth bared. I have a point to make with this, but we're going to have an aside about the Mary Celeste. After the Negrata found her floating in the Atlantic, all crew having mysteriously vanished, the Celeste was towed as salvage. No trace of said crew nor captain were ever found. Over the next several hundred years, many hypotheses have arisen from the Celeste's sudden dereliction. Everything from alcohol fumes rising as poison from the ship's cargo, kind of familiar, to alien abduction, also familiar, to water spouts, or even a good old giant squid attack. I don't think I've heard the squid angle with the Medan, but stranger things have happened. Some of these theories concerning the Mary Celeste are explanations from our modern understanding of science. Others, well, are the giant squid attacks. So, in 1884, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, wrote a story about a ghost ship called the Marie Celeste. That's Marie, not Mary. It's easy to gloss past that. The story, J. Hobcook Jeffson's Statement, which is a fictional tale, is presented in the ever-popular horror format of discovered journal entries, ye old found footage. The story takes place from the perspective of a crew member aboard the Marie Celeste, who is a first-hand witness to the disappearances, which are attributed to, well, black crewmen hijacking the ship to escape back to Africa. Doyle took pretty much every liberty with the story, including even the name of the ship, and submitted it to publication anonymously. The story itself is quite obviously a pulp horror, with kind of weird racial undertones. Obviously not an elaborate attempt to dupe anyone into believing it's an actual first-hand account, dredged up from thin air. It just has that veneer of plausibility, its masquerade mask. Now, the story of the Mary Celeste would resurface from time to time, as intrepid storytellers would claim to have found a missing bit of paper, or have heard from a mysterious surviving crew member who tells them the truth. And each time, the details would change. The number of crew members, the age of the captain's daughter who was aboard, everywhere from 2 years to 7 years old. In these retellings, the ship was often called the Marie Celeste, and some of these accounts were even published as truth in major newspapers. The point I'm making here is this: these stories are living, breathing things. They're exciting, lending just a bit of magic, that different horizon, one full of more possibilities than the world we see day after day. But why would the Marie, not Mary, Celeste ingrain herself so in these recountings? How did this particular story grab and hold the narrative? I believe it's that Arthur Conan Doyle's telling found a way to reflect the issues faced in society at the time, just draped with the costume of a fantastical tale. J. Hobcook Jeffson's Statement was a commentary on slavery, race in Africa, and freedom. Britain had officially abolished slavery in 1838, though that didn't necessarily apply to their colonies. While the United States had recently wrapped up a war over slavery in 1865. A fitting tale, then, for a ship in the center of the Triangle Trade. This takes us back to the Medan. Why did this last version seem to grab a hold in a way it previously failed? This post-war tale of chemicals and secrecy versus the earlier 1940s attempt. Was it just the sensational, the titillating and lurid appeal of gore and spectacle? Maybe. Or maybe it's just an updated idea of the Celeste, built for the context of the world surrounding it. The first time man had been given, or I suppose created, the ability to singularly reap destruction on a global scale. And still reeling from a level of horror, of death never really seen before. A world with weapons that thrust us on the brink of a new, unsure age. The fresh start of the Cold War, the nuclear-tipped arms race where, as a species, we had to confront the destructive power suddenly in our hands, alongside the shocking barbarity of the very recent, very fresh past. Not to mention many conflicts, either forgotten or simply ignored in the West, were still continuing. The Korean War had very well ignited, engulfing the peninsula. India and Pakistan were having fun interpreting arbitrary lines on British maps. And in 1947, the Netherlands were still fighting in Indonesia, attempting to suture shut the breaking seams of their empire with atrocity. Interesting then, the stories about a Dutch ship sailing by Indonesia. For many, the World War never really ended, and with it, the anxiety, the potential for destruction, the wreckage of its aftermath. Wreckage that would take quite a Herculean effort to repair itself from. Rebuilding, recovering while under the barrel of instability and conflict. Think of the minefields of the unexploded bombs infecting the ruins of cities like lice. The Royal Navy during 1955 and 56 scuttled 3 decommissioned ships, each loaded with between 16,000 and 28,000 bombs recovered from Nazi stockpiles. These bombs contained nerve agents such as taubin and sarin, as well as cyanide. Just sent them to the bottom of the sea as they had no other idea what to do. In 1984, a group of Danish fishermen were burned when their trawler dragged up an unexploded bomb loaded with mustard gas, dumped similarly from German stockpiles. Of course, there would be distrust of our governments, of tales of previously unimagined destruction, new ways of killing, and unfortunately, no accountability. In many ways, the world was and still is like the Ourang Medan. Something rickety, unstable, a new world as out of place as a ship is on the water. And ships sink all the time. It's simply a fact of their purpose and inevitability. Well, dear listeners, just as inevitably, that's all the time we have for tonight. Thanks for listening to our tale of a maritime mystery, of an eerie distress call and an even more unsettling implication. Is the truth simply what can be proven in logs and recordings? Or is it something more ethereal, the unfortunate real-world atrocities that live in the subconscious of the stories we tell? Alive in this tale of a ship, a phantom in the oldest and most unconquerable place the Earth has to offer. This leads back to the age-old question: if man cannot conquer, what is left? To destroy. Not just with weapons, but with the remains, the detritus of our destructive tendencies. Death by 1,000 years of trash. Personally, the world I want to live in is one of aliens and flying saucers, of curses and phantom mists, and yes, even those giant squid attacks. A world that, despite its problems, still asks, who's to say just what you'll find out there? Good night.
Tidings podcast and its original music is written, produced, and performed by yours truly, your host, Eric Johnson. Special thanks to Sofia Cordova for research on this episode. If you'd like to support this little foray into the dark, why not share an episode with a friend? Leave a review, like, subscribe, whatever. We're not currently accepting blood sacrifice due to a clerical error. Find us on social medias at the Ill Tidings Podcast. And hey, thanks for listening.